I initially started growing herbs for my livestock because buying large quantities of organic herbs is rather pricey. And when you're talking about worming or feeding herbs to livestock, it's a lot. It's not just a little package, it's, a bucket full. Chicks get a lot of comfrey and chickweed in the brooder and things like that. So there are times on the farm when animals are slightly confined and don't have access to a lot of weeds and herbs and forbs and grasses on the pasture. And so I try to supplement that by bringing them really high nutrient dense herbs into the brooders or into their pens so that they can always have access to something. I didn't actually intend to get into the culinary herb business. One of the big local herb growers decided to do something else, and we were able to dig hundreds of plants from her farm and start culinary herbs here on our farm. So that sort of launched me into doing culinary herbs for humans, as well as medicinal herbs for pigs and cows and chickens. There are certain herbs that I have to do from cuttings, and so I maintain a greenhouse full of mother plants, be it rosemary or thyme or my passion flowers. And all of those herbs are started from cuttings from my plants. And then anything I can start from seed, I start from seed, usually starting in February, propagating all the way through the season. Like I'm still planting things like dill and cilantro and basil, which have to be planted multiple times during the season to sell. My intention is to not to have to buy anything in. I only buy organic seed, and I only use my own cuttings for propagation. In the greenhouses, I have things like, parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme, all the normal culinary herbs. But in addition to that, I try to grow some odder herbs that might attract people to my stall. If they need epazote or shiso or chervil, most of the bigger vegetable growers aren't necessarily going to have those, where they are going to have dill, cilantro, and basil. So I'm trying more to focus on the odder, higher maintenance herbs because mine is more, hands-on little bits than big rows in the field. And then in the off season, I sell dried herbs, which has been great because at either end of the farmer's market season, when I don't have a lot of fresh and I don't have a lot of vegetables, I do have the dried product. So dried herbs, teas, herbs de Provence, things like that, which actually are easier to sell. People have a harder time working with fresh herbs than they do with dried herbs. So it's been a really good balance. I make my own potting mix. Because we process poultry, we have an excellent source of really, really rich compost. I compost all of the bones, the feathers, the blood, the offal. All of that stuff gets composted with straw and horse manure to make an incredibly rich supplement to my potting mix.
Which way to? So I'm going to flip this over.
I use a little bit of peat moss to balance the pH. I use perlite to lighten the mix because the plants are going to be in the pot for months sometimes. And then a little bit of green sand and soft rock phosphate to balance the NPK. I also use coir for water holding capability. The challenge for me in making my own potting mix is that my compost can really vary. And I can do a compost analysis early in the season to have a feel for what my NPK is like and my pH is like. But because all my compost is a little bit different, it changes throughout the season. It's wonderful that I can use my own waste products into my potting mix, and it probably is much cheaper than buying bagged potting mix. However, there's a lot more variability from batch to batch. I'm mixing it myself, and my compost is changing, and I'm trying to make 300 different varieties of herbs happy with the same mix, which is really challenging. So there's always somebody that's going to be unhappy. So I probably would have more consistent results if I purchased a potting mix, but I don't always know what goes into it. A lot of times those have blood meal in them, and I don't want to use conventional blood meal. I only want to use animal products if they were processed and raised on my farm. Same goes with manure. I don't want to buy in anybody else's manure. That's crazy. So I've just learned to work with the mix and try to be flexible and test it occasionally, and I really test the pH. That can be really important. And have a little bit of flexibility in what happens. The culinary herb business has been a fantastic front for the meat. By having the baskets of herbs out in front, that's a much lovelier display than a freezer. Typically, my potted herbs are $3.50 for a 4-inch pot. That varies. Some things are harder to propagate than others. My passion flowers are a little bit more expensive, and some of the harder herbs like lemon verbena and stuff. But for the most part, I try to keep my expenses down. I reuse pots a lot. I recycle tons and tons of pots. My customers bring them back to me. I've really just tried to keep the cost down as much as possible so that my herbs are a real reasonable price.